What I'm hoping to do today is take some time to bring you up to speed with some of the new stuff that's been happening in the science of hope. It has been changing radically in the last 10 years and quite dramatically in the last 5. And in the last 2, I've taken the time to try and read as much as I can about some of the nuances in not only the theory, but in how it is being applied. The first thing that I want to do is take time to talk about positive and negative emotions. Negative emotions restrict us. In other words, when we're frightened, when we're nervous, when we're anxious in any way, shape, or form, what that'll do is pull our perspective in. Whereas when we have positive emotions, we're much more likely to broaden and build resources. So this is more than just trying to feel good. This is about how we can transform negative emotions into positive in such a way that there is growth and readiness to participate. Mostly, what we're talking about is a shift in perception. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you could follow along the top edge of this mountain and look at the edge along the top, and then try to take a look about the accuracy of its reflection in the lake. If you were doing that and trying to make that assessment, I'm now going to ask you to turn your head, to put your left ear on your left shoulder and look at this image again. As you're doing that, on the far left, you should see the face of an adult, shoulders, and in prayer pose, and in front of the adult, the face of a child also in prayer pose. What's important about this shift in perception, I see some people are doing this, right? No, it's all the left ear on left shoulder. The important thing about this is that nothing changed about what you were taking in. What changed was your capacity and your ability to shift your perception. And that's what positive psychology is really about, and more specifically about hope. I am in the Positive Psychologists Union, which means I'm required to show this image for 30 seconds throughout every presentation. There are 4 bad jokes embedded in this today. That's the first one. So you got 3 more to suffer through. But if I were to ask you the question that normally goes along with this image, I've already distorted your perception into thinking that there really are only 2 possible answers, when the truth of the matter is this glass is completely full, half with water, half with air. So part of it is to start training ourselves to not just accept the way we see things when they first come in, but to challenge our perception at a deep level and start looking for other ways to see things. Ultimately, this is where we're going, to be able to see both ways simultaneously. This image should almost at the same time look at you as a face in half, kind of facing you, and as a profile. That's what we're trying to do with positive and negative emotions, to be able to see both of them, because the minute you can appreciate that there's another way of looking at things, what happens is you have a choice about how you're going to perceive it. Now you'll see a picture that you haven't seen before, and yet somehow you know that you want to turn your head. This is the essence of learned hopefulness. That once we're trained, once we're taught on how it is that we can shift our perception, we start looking at things differently, and we start anticipating that there may be another way to see them. I've likened negative thoughts to pebbles and positive thoughts to feathers. And it's not going to be where one good thing, one great big feather, will balance out the negative thoughts. Because of something known as the negativity bias, evolution has prepared us to worry. Jack and Sam are outside the cave, and Sam says, "Hey, there's some really interesting noises inside. I'm going to go in." And Jack says, "Nah, I'm going to stay out here." Because Jack's worried his genes get passed on. So our negative thinking is embedded into our DNA. It helped us survive. That's why it's so important. And that's why negative thoughts do have that negativity bias, because they have helped us stay alive. Positive thoughts are really not as strong as negative thoughts, but you can tip the scale, but you need lots of them. You need a lot of feathers. So, what I'm hoping for today is to awaken you to the idea that this is about trying to see as much good as you can, not to ignore the negative. If the gates are coming down as I'm getting ready to cross the railroad tracks, it's not a time to be optimistic. If the lake has a sign on it that says thin ice, I'm not going to try and look at that with a positive spin. But it is about generating small ways that we can start to accumulate some positivity for no other reason than to try and keep us balanced. In the last couple of years, I've had the opportunity to do some deep dive, some deep research into the nature of hope. And I've been putting together ways of understanding it and applying it. The book will be out June 1st, Learned Hopefulness. And much of what you're going to see in here is the result of what I've learned in that journey. The first thing I've learned is that it's really like the three blind men and the elephant. I took a look at all the existing theories on hope and the ones that had some good research. And each one has described hope like one of the blind men in the parable. If they held on to the tail, they thought hope looked like a rope. If they held on to the tusk, it looked like a spear. If they held on to the ear, they thought it was a bird. In other words, each of the scientists have grasped some nature of hope, but nobody, at least in my estimation, had the whole picture. So I asked a different question. What would hope look like if all the research was right? If everything that people had put together was correct? And what emerged from this was a very applied sense of how we can take hope and apply it in our lives directly. I've been very, very lucky that people who are outstanding in the field have seen this as an opportunity to get hope into the hands of people who need it. And I think these days that means all of us. The thing for me that was exciting about this is that we had maybe some of the top people in psychology, in education, in business, and in spiritual growth, all coming together around this topic, which I think bodes well for the idea that we can take what science has given us and apply it directly. In terms of learned hopefulness, I've tried to come up with a definition that gives us something to chew on. First of all, it's a voluntary activity. We're trying to help people learn something so that they are ready to cultivate a perspective that optimizes belief systems. That's important. The belief that you can have an influence in the future ends up being a very powerful way to understand how hope works. There were 5 myths that emerged in doing this work, and I want to share them with you. The first one was the big one. People think of hope as a positive emotion. It is not. In fact, it is the only positive emotion that requires negativity or uncertainty to be activated. This is a powerful finding because it means without uncertainty or negativity, there's no need for hope. If we were assured of the outcome of something, and if we didn't have a negative thought about something, we wouldn't need it. So it's important to, as the Buddhists would say, no mud, no lotus. It's important to recognize that the despair that we have, the uncertainty that we have, is a requirement for getting hope activated. The second myth: hope influences our belief system. Come to find out that it's just the other way around. If you take a look at any of the new medicines, what do? The new medicines have to go up against the placebo effect. And the placebo effect has to do with what we believe. It doesn't have to do with what's true, what's right, what's good. It only has to do with what we believe. So we're trying to understand hope now as something that grows out of our belief system because it gives us a different way of framing things. The third myth is that hope is the same as faith. We use those terms interchangeably, but the truth is it's not like that at all. There was a great interview that I heard back in the day with Catfish Hunter, who was a famous pitcher in the Hall of Fame. And he talked about how he took care of his body and how he worked out in the off season and how he took care of his arm and warmed it up and learned to hold it and then practiced in different weather systems so that he would be ready and ready and ready. But during this interview, he said there's a point, there comes a point where he has to let go. And then he has no control over what happens. Then it's a matter of faith that all that preparation, all that work, everything that he's done has brought him to the point of that release. And that's the difference here. Hope is when we feel we can positively impact our future, and faith is when we've surrendered to something else. And I like that metaphor about the baseball because all the hope has to do with what he can control, what he can do. But when he lets it go, some other force we have to surrender to. So hope and faith are not the same. They're not studied the same. They're not studied by the same groups, in fact. That when we're talking about hope, it's about the degree of control we have over the future, and more specifically, the belief we have control. I was invited to speak, of all places, at St. Patrick's Cathedral just recently. Very rare that a scientist or a clinician has the opportunity to do that. So it was a fantastic experience. And they asked me to explain the difference between hope and faith. And in preparation for that presentation, I found this quote: "Hope is faith holding out its hand in the dark." And that really helped me understand that there's this overlap. But what we're going to focus on is the degree to which we believe we can influence the future through our preparedness. Fourth myth is that hope is regulated by circumstance. We tend to think about hope as something that is in proportion to what our circumstance is, but it doesn't work that way. Hope is regulated by calibration and correction rather than circumstance, meaning that if we have an expectation that is here and our hope is here, then our work is to calibrate what we are going to set as our goal. It's in the transformation of that goal that we can get some sense of agency, some sense of connection. So we might have hoped to earn $50,000, or we might have hoped to run the mile in 8 minutes, or we might, whatever the goal is, when it's clear that there are obstacles, our job is not to just stop being driven toward the goal. It's to recalibrate. Maybe I run that mile in 8.5 minutes. Maybe it's 40,000, not 50. The idea of recalibration is really important and kind of central in most of the research on hope, particularly in medical recalibration. You know, people hope for this, but they have to adjust themselves here. And this brings up the idea of micro goals. So I have permission to tell this story. It was from a very long time ago when I was first starting out as a therapist. There was a woman who came to therapy who arguably, but quite likely, one of the most depressed people I had worked with at the time. And, as a young therapist, I was very eager to help and figure things out. But she was not improving. And after about 6 months, I was really getting fatigued with not seeing any improvement at all and starting to wonder, maybe I'm not in the right field, maybe I'm doing the wrong thing. And she showed up every week like clockwork and just didn't improve. We'd I'd make recommendations. She wouldn't take them. And then come back, tell her story. I'd make more recommendations. She wouldn't take them. And we went on that way. But one day, she came in about 10 minutes late, very unusual for her. And under her arm, she had a package of paper plates. Now, she had been divorced. The husband had run off. She was alone. She didn't feel good about herself, didn't feel good about her appearance, and had spiraled into this downward depression. And when I saw the paper plates, I was a little too optimistic at the time. I was thrilled. And I was like, oh, you're going to throw a party. I see you've got the paper plates. And she looked at me like I had six heads and was like, no. And then I said, oh, so maybe the family is coming over. You're going to have some cake and put it on the, I went through a bunch of scenarios that had to do with her finally starting to socialize. And she said, no, absolutely not. So my big question was, what are the paper plates for? And she said, well, I've run out of dishes. And I am sure she saw the contorted view on my face. And I asked her, what do you mean you ran out of dishes? And she said, well, I get my dinner and I put it on the plate and I eat from there. And then the next night, I moved the plate a little bit and I put the food on from there. And some, I can get 4 or 5 meals sometimes from one plate. Then I put the plate on the side and I get another plate. And she said, now I've used all the plates and I've gone through even all the china. So there was nothing left to eat on. So I got the paper plates. And, my big revelation was, why don't you wash the plates? And she looked at me as if I had 7 heads now. She said, do you think that's going to bring my husband back? You think this is going to make me feel better about myself and what's happened? I'm not going to feel better about anything by washing a plate. So I begged with her and pleaded with her to please, between now and next week, that's a whole week, wash one plate. And she finally, very reluctantly, agreed to do that. Well, I got a call that night from her. I thought she was pretty much kind of excited and manic about the whole thing. She says, I washed one plate and I felt great. Then I washed another one and another one and another. Now I've cleaned the closets. I feel great. I feel hopeful. The point of the story, I hope, is obvious, that small goals, micro goals, actually can help us get that feeling of accomplishment and connection. Without those goals, we kind of ruminate over the things we don't have. When we recalibrate and start setting goals that we can do, there's a sense of agency and connection with them. The 5th myth is that you either have hope or you don't. It's an on-off sort of thing, and nothing could be further from the truth. We find that hope can be activated, regulated, and facilitated by positivity. That's really important because it means that the power to transform yourself is within your grasp. It necessitates you looking at the world, looking at the situation, looking at your circumstance in a way that is searching for positivity. As an example, I often recommend to people to do a daily review when you wake up in the morning of the day before, the last 24 hours, to look for 3 gratitudes that you've had, that somehow in the last 24 hours, 3 things have happened that you have gratitude for, but you didn't take the time to acknowledge or validate. And they could be small. The weather might have been nice. You went for a walk and met a friend for lunch. A check that you had forgotten about was received in the mail. Small things, but important to acknowledge and feel grateful for. Believe it or not, it's this kind of nutrient. These are like emotional nutrients that facilitates hope. I'm going to stop here for a moment and just ask. I don't know if there are any questions, but Lindsay, if you could just check, or Beth, and let me know, and then I'll continue.
Hi, Dan. We do have one question.
Sure.
What is the role of hope in advocating for positive change?
A very, very, very good question. A way to think about it is that if hope is the only positive emotion that requires negativity or uncertainty, then it becomes the transformational experience for people. Because when we get hit with a situation that knocks us back and we start to ruminate about it, we don't feel we have control over it, and we don't feel that we can apply any effort to it because it's not going to pay off. If we go in that direction, we'll generate a downward spiral. In other words, we might fall into the hole, but then we're digging a hole deeper for ourselves. What hope does is, at the very least, it starts that balance between the pebbles and feathers. You start finding small ways to acknowledge what's already good. Gratitude and kindness become really powerful in this regard. And what we found with people with high hope, which the next part of this presentation, is that what people do who have high hope is that they're making different decisions very rapidly about the negativity that's coming in. In essence, what they're doing, which I'll reiterate in a minute, is they're not seeing the negativity as as an obstacle. They're seeing it as an opportunity and as a challenge. In other words, they move toward the conflict, not away from it. So that I think is an overview of the role. I'll continue, and then if there are more questions, please ask them, and I'll try to respond. So when we talk about resilience and coping, there's a couple of different ways that we can frame that. There's regressive coping, transformational coping, and proactive coping. And the first one has to do with a style of avoidance. Some kind of thing is on our doorstep that seems overwhelming and difficult. And if we avoid dealing with it, that's the beginning of the downward spiral. And I'm going to talk about that first here, if I can go to it. If you look at this cycle, basically what happens is when there's a crisis, if our first response to it is to avoid dealing with it, we're actually in a good place because we get out of the cycle. It gets us off the hook in the short run. That's why avoidance is so popular, right? But it actually perpetuates a cycle that weakens us systematically. If we get off the hook in the short run with avoidance, it feeds one of four negative emotions: depression, anger, guilt, and resentment. And any one or any combination of those tend to build up. And what that does is it lowers our self-esteem because there's part of us, part of our psyche that knows we never really dealt with that. We just avoided it, which weakens us when the next crisis comes along or we have to confront the same one. Avoidance then becomes the strategy for coping, and we start a downward spiral where it becomes more and more difficult to mount a response. In transformational coping, something I call a transformational mindset. You know, we've heard a lot about fixed and growth mindsets, but the essence of this is really about a transformational mindset that I am not going to see what's happening as an obstacle only. I'm going to see it as an opportunity or a challenge. Yeah, I might have to go around it, but you know, in Japanese psychotherapy, Morita psychotherapy, the way that they frame most of their challenges and difficulties is with metaphors of water. So let me just share that with you. If there's a stream and the water is rushing down the stream and there is a rock sticking out of the stream, the water doesn't freak out about it. It doesn't see that rock as an obstacle. It goes around it. It parts around it. It's something that has to be dealt with. It's a challenge, but it's an opportunity for this water to find itself again. In preparing this, I was able to find this quote, which I like very much. Sometimes when you're in a dark place. You think you've been buried, but actually you've been planted. And literally, after putting the slideshow together, I walked out my front door, and there were the buds of spring. And to me, seeds are just fascinating things. There's a great quote I like to start my classes at the Spirituality Center with, that says, by Schuller, um, any fool can count the number of seeds in an apple, but only God can count the number of apples in a seed. This idea that the seed has all this potential in it that we can't even fathom. And when you think about the life of a seed, it's actually not a bad title for an article. I should write that. But if you think about the life of a seed, all the things it needs would seem to be stripped away from it. It's buried in dirt. So nutrients, water, sunlight, all the things that would make it grow are absent. And yet somehow in the struggle, it evolves. And we have proactive coping. This, of course, is from Star Wars. Be mindful of the future, but not at the expense of the moment. Well, they were in the right church, but what the science shows of this is exactly the opposite. Be mindful of the moment, but not at the expense of the future. They've studied mindfulness, and they've studied expectations, proactive coping, right? And what they find is that mindfulness is really very helpful, and somehow trying to anticipate the future is very helpful. But the most powerful combination occurs when you can do both, when you can be both mindful of what you're doing in the moment and having a plan for the future, planning for coping with stress in the future, planning for dealing with things that are coming up. And the best metaphor I can find for that is with cooking. I am not a good cook. I specialize in hockey pucks. So I invite people over to my house for dinner. They say they'll come if I have it catered only. So I am not a good cook, but I have really dear friends who are good cooks. And what I notice about their mindset is they have a beautiful proactive coping mindset. When they're chopping the carrots, getting ready to make soup, they are completely mindful. They have their focus in that moment. But a part of their brain is also thinking about what else they have to get ready. So they'll be optimally ready in the future. So they're present, and they're thinking about what comes next. What other vegetables do they need? Does the water need to be turned on at this time? They start thinking about how the present moment impacts the future. And that's called proactive coping. That's really what we're talking about. What hope does is it helps us move from transformational into proactive. I'm going to stop here just for a moment to see if there's any other questions that I may need to answer before I go on.
Yes, Dan, we actually had one question from Peggy who said, can you lose hope and become hopeless? Or is this the lacking of resilience?
What a beautiful question. Thank you, Peggy, for asking that. That's a really powerful question. Um, the unfortunate thing is I have to go all the way over this way to answer it. So I haven't lost sight of what the question is, but I have to answer it based on new research. And to be very fair, most folks aren't aware of the new research. So I'm just going to take a minute to explain that and then come on back to answer it. Um, Most of you, I would imagine, know about the term learned helplessness. Marty Seligman, somebody I've worked for the last 10 years, was the person in the mid 70s who came out with a book on helplessness based on a bunch of research where they thought that if you were in one situation and you were taught how to be helpless, that you would be passive in a future situation when there was no need to be helpless. So they gave dogs shocks, and Marty's already come out and said he would never do something like that again. But, back in the 60s, that's what they were doing. They gave them shocks, and then they couldn't do anything about stopping the shocks. Nothing they did mattered. Once they learned nothing they did mattered, they became passive. They put them in a situation where it would be really easy to escape. They would have part of a floor electrified and a very, very low hurdle that they would have to jump over to escape it. The dogs just gave up. They didn't do anything to escape it because of what they'd previously learned. That has dominated the field basically up until last year. They did a 50-year follow-up. They have been researching learned helplessness for the last 50 years. Now, back in the 60s, they didn't have all the equipment that we have now to study brain chemistry, fMRIs to see what's actually going on. And what they found is that nothing was learned. Now, these are the same researchers, Stephen Mayer and Marty Seligman. They studied it all over again, and they realized they got the theory wrong. Completely wrong, not just a little bit wrong. In fact, as wrong could be, because it meant that whatever was shutting the animals, people down was chronic aversive stimuli. Something really unpleasant shut people down, but it wasn't shutting them down so they were learning anything. They found that the brain has a switch. There's something called the dorsal raphe nucleus and the prefrontal ventromedial nucleus, and they have a connection. What that means is that if something is really bad, it's as if evolution is telling us, do not waste your energy. The situation is hopeless. Shut down. But they had found in the original studies that about a third of the dogs would have the shocks, go into that other situation and not be passive. They just kind of, shook it off and jumped over the hurdle. And they were fascinated, like, why would that be? Why didn't they have learned helplessness? Now we have that answer. Because it isn't unlearning what's happened in the past. It's making a risk assessment of the future that pulls us out of a difficult place. See, in other words, let me think. Your laptop, right? If your laptop overheats, what'll happen? It'll shut down, right? It's not learning anything, right? But it'll just shut down because there's too much going on, and it'll conserve its damage control. We're built that way as human beings. But the question becomes, what do you do? Do you just have to wait for the cooling to begin? Or is there something you could do that might facilitate that process? That's what hope is, and that's a little bit about how hope and resilience get wired together. Because for hope, what we're saying is there's things you can do. You can buy a cooling pad. You can buy fans. You can clean the vents underneath your laptop. You can do things so that when you shut down, you're not going to take that long to come back. And in resilience and the idea about resilience, and by the way, just so that you know, the largest consumer of positive psychology is the U.S. Army. We have 1.1 million soldiers who are being trained in resilience reactions. And one of the things that they're learning how to do is they're learning how to meditate and reframe things. And one of the reframing things that they're doing is they're learning how to challenge their belief system. So here's the interaction. Now I get to answer the question after all of that. Right? Here's the interaction between resilience and hope. For hope, it's really based on our belief that we'll have control in the future. For resilience, we're challenging the belief that is forging a downward spiral, not really necessarily challenging the effect it'll have in the future, but challenging our rumination about the negative thought. So resilience is about keeping us from going backward, and hope, as it turns out, is about what we believe we can control in the future. Now that I put everybody to sleep, are there any other questions about that? You've learned more about shocking dogs than you'd ever want to know.
Thank you, Dan. That was wonderful. We don't have any other questions at this time.
Okay, so let me do this and move on to here. What we found out with people with hope is that they tend to fall into one of two categories. People who have high hope are making a series of decisions and have these choices that they're making, versus people with limited hope who are on the other side of the equation. The important part here is to take a look at negativity as and uncertainty in a different way, other than an obstacle. So let's see how the high hope people do it. The first is that they see things, rather than see things as fixed and unchangeable, they see possibilities. That's powerful stuff, because it means that if you're confronting a situation and you think, oh, there's nothing I can do about it, you're going to be right. You know, there was a famous saying by Henry Ford: think you can, think you can't. Either way, you're going to be right. And it tends to be really powerfully true. What are the opportunities or challenges that can come from a difficult circumstance? My Asian friends tell me that the symbol for crisis is the same symbol for opportunity, depending on the context, and I couldn't agree more with that. Next one is, there's a reason why some adages stay around, like stop and smell the roses kind of thing. High people intentionally focus on beauty, benefits, and blessings. The high hope people that I know and what I've seen from the research are constantly looking for the good. They are constantly hunting the good, as we say in positive psychology. This does a couple of things. The first thing that it does is it keeps you from focusing on the negative. And my strong recommendation, by the way, to not have more than 15 minutes of news watching a day. I don't care how you break it up, 3 5-minute periods, a 10-minute and a 5-minute, one 15-minute period. But more than that, the news sells and is intriguing to people because of its negativity. There are some good news sites. Actually, my class in positive psychology at Columbia right now, we're putting together a list of resources. But one of the real fun ones is tankgoodnews.com, TANK, goodnews.com. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but they are reporting good news, good things that people are doing throughout this crisis. And we need that. We need to focus on that. And if you saturate yourself with bad news or the news, what'll happen is you'll ruminate. It's like you're adding pebbles on that side of the seesaw. And what we really want to do is add more of the things that are coexisting. If you go back to remembering the things where I was talking about a shift in perception, that one where you could see it head on and a profile, it's not ignoring the negative. It's just saying that there are other elements that are happy, that are embedded. Before I became a positive psychologist, I was a trauma expert. And in fact, was a co-author of the first book the American Psychological Association put out for healing trauma in people with intellectual disabilities. And I used to conduct my trauma intervention interviews in a very different way than I do now. We'll get to the trauma, but I also want people to tell me about some of the things that were going on simultaneously when things were not okay. So instead of people just telling me about the pain, I'll ask them, um, were there people there who helped you when you were going through this? Can you tell me about them? And sure enough, in every instance, they talk about somebody who was kind, somebody who had a good thought or a good word for them, or some direct help, like a family member, that kind of thing. So high hope people tend to find these things not as a way of ignoring the negative, but as a way to bring balance. People who score higher on measures of hope cultivate positive emotions such as gratitude and kindness. They make a point to not fall prey to habits of negative thinking. So, in addition to noticing beauty and benefits, what people with high hope do is they make their their actions follow their thoughts. So they focus on expressing gratitude. They focus on expressing kindness or validating it. One of the things I've been advocating for Holly now is this is a time to send an email or a text to somebody who's been very helpful to you, a mentor, a teacher. Who's done some act of kindness for you along the way. It's funny, I've been researching for years something called virtual gratitude. And in one of the latest pieces that I've written, um, one of the editors said, "Oh, virtual gratitude, that sounds more like doing a Zoom call and having gratitude." I just got a note back and I said, "Yep, that's kind of like what we mean, to reach out and let people know that they've been important in your life and valuable." It sounds like small potatoes, but it's not. Um, they tend to focus on strengths rather than weaknesses. People with low hope are really immersed in identifying their weakness and the weakness of others, whereas people with high hope focus on strength. This is an important one, and part of why I mentioned the story about the dish before washing the one dish. We might have to recalibrate our goals. What happens is if we can recalibrate properly, we get a type of engagement with our life, which becomes really important because me cleaning out a drawer for 20 minutes doesn't sound like rocket science, but the truth of the matter is, as I'm doing it, I'm feeling engaged, connected, and in 20 minutes I have a sense of accomplishment, and like, wow, that time was well spent. So don't ignore small goals right now, these micro goals, because they can help you feel a sense of agency. um, Almost everybody on the planet right now is having their sense of purpose upended, and has to take a step back and recalibrate and think about, okay, what's my purpose now? So I have had to do that in these kinds of presentations. I've had to step up and do preparation. Most of the stuff that you're looking at here is newly prepared. I've had to shift my energy and focus toward the applied nature of hope. And something I wasn't anticipating having a big, big, big impact in my life. Now I've had to shift that. You'll have to do that too. And finding the things that open that sense of purpose up and meaning for you are important. There's a friend of mine, Emily Stefani Smith, who's written a book on purpose and meaning. So if you just Google her name, Emily Smith, it's really one of the most delightful books on grasping purpose and meaning in our life, which tends to be something that pulls us rather than pushes us. And that can be a powerful influencer. And finally, the last of these is that people low in hope often choose isolation, while those high in hope make choices and cherish and nurture connection with others. Chris Peterson had a phrase when he was asked, who's the chief architect of the VIA character survey. He was asked, can you give us a really short definition of positive psychology? And he said, sure, I've got 3 words: other people matter. And that's probably the most important takeaway here, is to make sure that you keep your connections and your network fresh, that you have gratitude for people around you, a sense of kindness about it, and staying connected, even though it's virtual right now. We're staying connected. And my neighbors and I, we sit out on the back part of our we're on a dock, and we're about 30 feet away, so we have the social distancing going, but it's lovely to just share and connect with people. Even though it's modified, the connections are really important. I'm coming close to the end of the material, and I want to make sure that there's enough time for questions, so let me stop here and just see if any questions are coming in.
Hi, Dan. We had one more question.
Sure.
How do we promote hope in people that we support? Thinking
Wow.
about people, especially people who are in large congregate settings who are confined, especially at this moment, and the only contact that we have is by phone or FaceTime.
Sure. Terrific question. And let me try to answer that with a metaphor. If somebody has received a huge tablespoon of salt in their life, and they're coming to you with this tablespoon of salt, a way to think about it is that if our response is a 6-ounce cup of water to put that salt in, and we're putting it in that small space, the water is going to get really salty, very salty, and the person is not likely to feel a great relief from that. But if we can create a larger container, if we can create a lake for that tablespoon of salt to go in, the pain doesn't lessen. The tablespoon of salt is still there, but it's been opened up into a much larger space. So as healthcare workers, as people on the front line, the thing I would say is to help hold the space for someone who has that pain and that struggle. Don't feel like you have to solve it or fix it, but you can create a lake for them to put that pain in deep empathy. One of the things that we know is that you might not be much more than a benevolent witness to someone's pain. But to do that, and to do that well, you need to have self-compassion. On my website, dantomasulo.com, there is a 2-minute video on self-compassion exercise. And I'll just encourage you to go learn it and do it. There's no cost for any of that. But it's a very simple exercise to facilitate your own capacity for self-compassion, because what we find is that in order to be compassionate for others, you need to be really okay with you and to learn how to nurture yourself. Are there any other questions, Beth?
This is Joni. I just want to say that was beautiful. Sorry, I have to say that.
You're welcome, Joni. Thank you for saying so.
I second Joni, and there are no other questions at this time, Dan. Thank you.
Okay. So hope is a verb. Let me talk about that. Here's the definition of hope as a noun and as a verb. And I've made it, you know, between the book Learned Hopefulness and these speaking things. What I'm after is changing the definition. Um, this isn't about you wanting something to happen or waiting for it. Make something happen. Again, it might only be chopping carrots and making soup, or cleaning a drawer out, but make something happen because that's the thing that's going to fill us up. And that's not to say, by the way, that you have to do that 24/7, 365. What I'm saying is, if you get fatigued because of what you're dealing with, by all means, take a step back. Take a nap, rest, decompress, watch yet another thing on Netflix, right? But if you want to feel better, make something happen. Let me move here. I'm going to bring this back to you because I'd like you to look at these 7 things about high hope people, because I think they have something that can teach us. Looking for possibilities, noticing the good. Take a look at this and pick 1 or 2 areas that you realize you're a little too much on the left side and might want to move to the right side. Pick an area and think of what it is you might be willing to do to make intentionally different choices. It's what I call intentional well-being. Making intentional choices ends up being the key to understanding how hope is activated. So let me stop there and tell you, I've put together some resources for you. If you were to text hopeful to 44222, you'll get an opt-in that will allow you to get some new resources. I've attached a sheet of some of the things that are out there that are good. I've also included a new article I've written for Learned Hopefulness on a piece of research out of Harvard. The Flourishing Center has done a marvelous job on the impact of hope on aging, and it is stellar. There are 10 things, 5 physical, 5 psychological, that they find are just vastly improved if you have a sense of hope. So it's an article that will tell you about that, as well as an article I've written on psychological capital, this idea of self-efficacy, of resilience, optimism, and hope, and how that can be applied at work. So let me stop there and see if there are any thoughts or questions.
And we had one additional question come in response to your response to the previous question. Amy asks, how do you create or find the lake for others?
That's great. Great question. All I can share with you are things that I know feed that lake and help people find it. Probably, and the reason why I mentioned about self-compassion is that's your container. And so I always start with that. I think there are layers of this sort of stuff, but starting with self-compassion, first of all, you can never go wrong. It's not like somebody's going to overdose on self-compassion, right? So the idea of cultivating a way to be very gentle with yourself becomes a way that you start to take the salt in your own life and expand the container that it's in. Because you can't really do for others that which you can do for yourself, right? So you starting with self-compassion starts that. The next layer I would have is to have people who are at the front door. Oh, there's someone at my front door. I'm usually up here in my writing room and can't see or hear anything, so I apologize for that. The second layer is to be around people who know your strength, who can strength spot you, who see your true abilities. They call it the Michelangelo effect. You want to be around people who can spot that thing of beauty inside of you, because that helps to expand the lake. So the first is what you have on your side, what you do for self-compassion. Then you want to be with people who can fill you up. They become sort of like your interpersonal nutrients. I just made that up, so we'll see. You'll probably see an article on that. And then the third layer. I really do mean that, by the way, about people. The term is a little frivolous, but people do fill us up. And the people who don't, right? Don't spend as much time with them. Spend time with people who really see your gift and can celebrate that. And then the last thing is that lake expands when you extend yourself to others, and you strength spot them. Because in doing that for them, it's actually expanding your own capacity.
Thank you, Dan. You've built everybody's capacity today.
Well, thanks, Jody. Thanks for inviting me, and happy to be of help. And if people opt in with this, with the hopeful to 44222, they'll have my email. And then if you have any follow-up questions, you can feel free to ask them.
Thank you, Dan, very much. We have reached our 3 o'clock mark, so we are going to close today's session. We can't thank you enough for sharing all of this information with us today. And we're also going to share the materials and a link to the recorded presentation on the Center for Start Services website, so you can find.
And in the
that there.
AUCD SIG, MHIDD SIG. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.